I'm Boyana Konforti. I'm Director of Scientific Strategy and Development here at HHMI. I am really, really excited to welcome all of you here. This has been a meeting that's been about a year in the making, and it began with a kind of informal conversation between DORA and HHMI about how we could change how science and scientists are evaluated. And there are many people that we need to thank, or I need to thank, before we get this meeting started. Erin O'Shea, who's HHMI's president, Bodo Stern, Chief Strategic Officer, Erika Shugart, who's the CEO of ASCB, Stephen Curry from Imperial College London and chair of DORA's steering committee, and of course, all the extraordinary HHMI staff here, the conference services, communications, AV, but really the driving force behind this meeting has been Anna Hatch. She's really had the unenviable task of taking suggestions, comments, and ideas from me, Erika, and Stephen, and somehow performing some magic and coming up with consensus, which we couldn't even imagine. So we're very grateful to her for that. And I'm also really looking forward to meeting and working with some of you so that we can actually create the change we want to see. And in order to do that, I want to make clear that HHMI welcomes the participation of persons of all identities and all backgrounds, that we expect attendees to treat each other with courtesy and respect, and that if you experience any inappropriate behavior, speak to your event organizer. That would be me. And Bodo is also part of the event organizing team. And that all reports will be investigated and we will take appropriate action. And so here is our information, should you need it, but it's also going to be outside, right beside conference services desk, on a screen there for you to have our contact information. And now I'd like to welcome Erika Shugart, who, as I said, is CEO of ASCB. She's going to tell us something about the results of the survey that I hope all of you took, and also the goals of the meeting. So let's get this party started.
Well, hello. Well, I was going to do some thank yous too, and I think Boyana, because she was standing up here, couldn't thank herself, but it was really a team with Boyana and Anna that put this together, and I just am so excited to be here with all of you for the next couple of days. So I am here from a scientific society, the American Society of Cell Biology, and I'm really happy to see a number of our members in the audience. It's always nice to reconnect with them. But I like to think about, with the purpose of a scientific society, what are we here to do? So I think a lot about this. We're really a community of scientists, and we're here to help advance our members' professional career. We're here to advance the community and represent them in all sorts of ways, whether it's advocating for them on their behalf or helping them work together to achieve their goals. So I often talk to scientists about research assessment. And it's an interesting conversation. We always sort of start out, and there's an acknowledgement of all the challenges. The fact that in the area that I represent, it's a hyper competition. There are more qualified candidates than there are academic positions. And we talk about biases, and we talk about the disadvantages people have and the advantages that other people may have. And so we have these conversations, and then there's often a moment, not always, but there's often a moment where then the member I'm talking to turns around and says, but science is a meritocracy. and I'm like, well, I'm sure that everyone that makes it through in academia is highly worthy. I get to meet them every day. They're amazing human beings doing absolutely amazing work. But I also know that there is a group of people that are also very worthy that perhaps are not doing that path because they were not able to do that path, which is fine because there are many, many career paths, but nonetheless, I think unless we are thinking about what kind of community we want, then we really aren't doing what we need to do. Because if we continue to make just individual decisions about people and what we view as their merit, then we're not going to build a community actively. So we need to really think about, and I think this is one of the challenges that I throw out for us to do, is sort of how do we get the diversity that we need to have a strong community? How do we ensure that we can think about what we want to see when we look out? And I think that's one of the things we want to think about, because it really comes down to research assessment. It's not a bunch of individual decisions. It's really about forming a community. It's really about growing that up. So that's what I think about, and I'm really looking forward to thinking about it with all of you over the next couple of days. But I am up here to talk a little bit about a survey that was done, and I'm doing this on behalf of Anna, who put all of this together. So we did an informal survey. This is by no means a scientific survey. It is not a representative sample at all. There will be no error bars on anything that you will see. But it was a good opportunity for us to get some community feedback beyond those that can be here today, and ask some questions to give us a little sense of what people are thinking about out in the wider world. And we did get 190 responses total. And who were they from? So here's sort of a pie chart that represents the career levels of the folks that were able to respond. And what you see in sort of the darkest color down there at the bottom is the ones that I think have been through the majority of the hurdles. You know, they're tenured professors, so they've been through the hiring, they've been through, you know, at least one round of promotion and tenure. They still are going to be looking at research assessment and grants, and as they move up, as they move up in their career. But I sort of think, you know, that's the biggest group, is those tenured professors. We then have a number of other folks that professors, postdoctoral fellows, and graduate students, professors pre-tenure, I should say, postdoctoral fellows and graduate students that still have a pretty major hurdle in front of them. You know, it's like they're either still looking to be hired or they're still looking to like get that tenure. So that was another group. The other group that's up there in the kind of the lightest color is, generally speaking, people that are either emeritus or people that are outside of academia. And then we do have a nice representation of staff scientists as well. So the first question we asked was about mission statement and whether it is aligned to the practices that people see in the promotion and funding decisions. And what you see is in the middle gray there, a lot of people don't know. This is not unexpected. Many people cannot recite their institution's mission statement, so they really may not know about this. Then we have about 40%, 41% said yes, and then a pretty sizable portion, 21% said no, which is kind of highly unfortunate because one would hope that the values of the institution reflect the mission of the institution, but as we all know, that does not always happen. So the next question we asked was about journal-based metrics and whether they were required in certain areas. And this was the question, when you read the comments, that actually generated probably the most debate about the phrasing of the question, because most people are like, well, you're asking about required. It's not required, but everybody uses it. So I think what we see here is, you know, if people are asking sort of, is it required? And then whether it's used is sort of a different question. So I would just generally say, speaking of seeing the comments, that probably all the yeses, if we're asking about use, would actually be quite a bit larger. Because most people are like, well, it's not required, but you know, we still use it. So what we see in hiring decisions, it's almost evenly split between people that do use metrics and people that don't, with a portion that I don't know. Fairly similar in the annual performance reviews. It's really in promotion and tenure that we see the journal-based metrics are used by more than a majority of the institutions, or required, I should say, required by the majority of institutions according to our surveyors. So then we sort of moved on from what is going on to asking our respondents to tell us a little bit about what they think should be valued. So we asked first about hiring, and then we asked about promotion and tenure. So first you sort of see a list here of how important people thought the following items were when making decisions for hiring. And what you see in kind of the top four, I think, are, and you'll see something very similar when we move over to the promotion and tenure, is, you know, people care about research, they care about whether you are going to be able to get money, they want to know you, and then what the content of the letters of recommendation, which I do think is interesting. You look a little bit farther down. So then the one that's just underneath that is prestige of the journals. So that's kind of one that I know, generally speaking, DORA is not as excited about. It is not so keen on. Get sort of teaching and mentorship. And then we have reputation of individuals, which can often mean kind of like, where did you come from? How do I know your academic genealogy? So again, one that has raised some concerns and some of the assessment. And then down at the bottom is a lot of those more service-oriented kinds of approaches, public engagement and open science. We can see a very, very similar picture over and in the promotion and tenure. So this is the same, very similar list, but instead asking about making, what is important for promotion and tenure. It's a little bit shorter because we're not asking the questions about familiarity with institutions and things. They're all in the same institution. So again, the top three parallel what we saw in that other one. Can you get money? Do I think your research program is what we want it to be? And what do people have to say about you? So we see the same top ones. And again, that middle kind of the same with teaching, mentorship, and then down at the bottom, again, some of the more service-oriented and things around reproducibility and open science. So you can kind of take a look there and I think about, because again, this gets back, I think we're going to be talking a lot about how do people's values intersect with the research assessment. So the next one was asking, and I think this is a little bit of a loaded question, I will admit, on this part of the survey. What is more useful to evaluate your research quality, metrics or written description of significance? And given that most people that saw this probably are somewhat familiar with DORA, maybe were like, well, I know the right answer for this question, which of course is the written description of significance, right? But nonetheless, even knowing that, still 12% said metrics. So, and it's not that metrics are bad. I'm making a joke because DORA is kind of known as being the anti-impact factor, and it's because that's really the misuse of metrics. It's really taking a metric that's designed for one thing and using it for another. And we're not necessarily anti-metric, but we do have some hesitations. That's a good way to phrase it. All right, and then the last question we asked was really a question. So we're going to be talking over the next couple of days about institutional change and change in organizations. And there are different approaches that we can be taken to that. And so this last question is really asking about kind of a top-down versus bottom-up approach. It's like, what are the interventions that are most likely to decrease your institution's reliance on journal-based metrics and research evaluations? And so, the top one right there, total top-down kind of thing. It's like mandatory requirements from funding agencies. Updated review and promotion and tenure policies, that can kind of come from a lot of different directions. It could be a top-down, it could be bottom-up, but nonetheless having clear stated policies, then training people on how to hopefully use those policies so they align, the practice can align to the policy. Then we have one, which I know we'll be talking about over the next couple of days around working groups, creating working groups to really evaluate. That's kind of much more about a bottom-up approach. So that's getting the folks that are involved thinking about how can we make change in our organization. And then you can see, as we go on down, a few of the other kinds of topics there. So that's a little bit of the survey, just to give a little taste, a little bit of thinking about what we might want to do. But now I want to just talk about the goals. So hopefully you all saw them on the website, but just to remind everyone. So what we're here to do, one, is to encourage establishment of working groups at institutions in order to evaluate research assessment practices, look at how those practices align with policies, and then hopefully use those working groups to improve the policies and the practices. The second is, and this is one of the things I'm really excited about over the next couple of days, is that we've brought in people with expertise in culture change and human design and fields that are quite different than the science that I'm familiar with, and to help us think about how do you actually do this? What is some of the evidence-based research that can help inform our policies into practice. And then finally, the room is really exciting. I don't know about you, but I have had a chance to talk with people from a lot of different backgrounds already. And so we hope that everybody will walk away with new collaborations around research assessment, be able to meet some new folks, think about things in new ways. And to kind of help that, I wanted to sort of give a little hand poll. I know if the folks out there on the internet, you can raise your hand when I say your type too. But just to give a little sense of who's in the room, and you may raise your hand to more than one of these up here. So first, who's a faculty member in the room? Okay, so we got about a lot of faculty members, so maybe 80% of the room is raising for faculty. What about university administrators? Oh, we have a sizable number of university administrators. A little bit of doubling up there, but yeah, it's like at least half the room looks like administrators. What about culture change experts? Okay, smaller number of hands, and they're a little bit shy. So, but they're out there. All right, so early career researchers. Excellent. So we have a good smattering of early career researchers here. What about funders? Do we have our funders? Oh, we got some funders here. Yeah, quite a few funders. Excellent, because you need to do those mandatory things that tell us what to do. What about scientific society staff? We got some proud over there in the corner and up here in the front. Librarians. Oh, look at our librarian crew. We got a good representative of librarians in the back. And then the catch-all other category of representatives from other nonprofit initiatives. And good, we have about maybe 10% to 15% of the room was those. So you can see that it's a really great group, really looking forward to meeting with all of you. And now I'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Stephen Curry. He is the chair of DORA's steering committee, as well as a professor and the assistant provost for equality, diversity, and inclusion at Imperial College London, and he will be introducing our keynotes. Stephen.
Thank you very much, Erika, and let me welcome you, myself, all of you, to this meeting. I, too, am very excited about it. Coming from the United Kingdom, we don't get very excited about very much, okay? We tend to play it cool and, you know, things are okay, but I am really looking forward to the next 2 or 3 days. And we have a great keynote session tonight to kick things off and set the ball rolling and get us in the mood before we head for the bar at 9 o'clock. And so we have a slight change to our program. So Erin O'Shea, unfortunately, is not able to join us this evening. So we have a surprise guest speaker who's coming in third place at the end. And so we are going to start off initially then with Professor Erin McKiernan. And Erin is a professor in the Department of Physics, so I'm from physics myself originally, so I'm very glad to see that, at the National Autonomous University in Mexico. So I met Erin for the first time today. We have known each other through Twitter. That's how I know most of my social circle these days. But I know Erin to be a fearless and tireless advocate for open science. She's the founder of the Why Open Research Project, which is an educational site for researchers to learn how to share their work. And we are very glad to have her as an extremely valuable member of the DORA steering committee. And Erin, as well as being a physicist and biophysicist, does a lot of really important work actually looking at the nuts and bolts of research evaluation. And she's been involved in the Skolcom Labs Review, Promotion and Tenure Project, and has authored quite a number of works looking at the use and misuse of the journal impact factor. So Erin is going to talk to us this evening about how the journal impact factor is used in review, promotion, and tenure in the United States and Canada. Erin.
All right, can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Super. Okay, well, thanks so much. I'm super excited to be here. Kind of one of the areas that I'm really focusing on these days is research evaluation, so this is a perfect forum for that. So yeah, I want to talk to you guys today about some of the work we've been doing. This is a collaboration. I'll talk about some of the people that are involved in this project. And basically the idea is we need more information. If we're going to reform the evaluation systems, academic evaluation systems, we need more information about actually what is going on in these systems. What are we measuring? What are we focusing on? So that's the focus of this project. Before we kind of dive in, of course, this presentation is openly licensed. Feel free to take pictures, tweet, whatever you want to do with that. And I'll post the slides on Figshare afterwards so everybody has access to those. All right, so let's talk promotion and tenure. And I just want to give a shout out to my dad who does these beautiful cartoons for our Why Open research site. So yeah, promotion and tenure. We're talking research evaluation, right? Obviously, promotion and tenure is not the only place where research evaluation occurs, but it is a large part of how academics are getting evaluated. And it's kind of this tenet of the academic world that if you work hard enough and you check enough of the boxes that you're going to move up the ranks and eventually be awarded this job security, right? And so that's what a lot of academics are shooting for. And it's also, understandably, what is driving a lot of faculty behavior. And in particular, if we're interested in open science, when we survey faculty, when we survey researchers, a lot of researchers cite concerns about promotion and tenure, about moving up the ranks, about getting those points and checking those boxes as a top reason why they don't end up sharing their work. So they say, yeah, I think open access sounds like a great idea. I think sharing my data sounds like a great idea. but I'm not going to do it because I need to publish in those high impact factor journals, or I don't want to get scooped, right? So this is a huge driving force behind how faculty behave and how they decide to share or not share their work. So the questions here are, at the university level, what are universities valuing? And also this relates back to this survey question about mission statements, right? Is that lining up with their mission statement? What are universities rewarding? Because these unfortunately might not be the same thing. And what specifically counts towards promotion and tenure? When we were getting together, initially Juan Pablo Alperin and Meredith Niles and I, so these are my collaborators, we realized that there's a lot of anecdotal information, right, about what counts towards promotion and tenure, but we didn't have many solid numbers, data on what's actually in these documents and what's getting rewarded. So that was the motivation behind this project, to kind of find out what was in there and what's counting when we're evaluating faculty. So, ranking, right? So we know that a lot of these evaluation systems involve assigning points for different things, and especially at the hiring level and maybe even at the promotion level, ranking faculty and saying, okay, this one has more points than this one, right? But what are we actually awarding points for? And are we awarding points for the things that maybe we think we should be awarding points for? Are we awarding points for things that will promote the university's values and the university's missions? There's a lot of this going on, right? And I think I don't have to sell this here. So there's a lot of impact factor worship going on. There's a lot of faculty hiring committees or faculty evaluation, promotion and tenure committees looking at the impact factor of the journals that faculty are publishing in and saying, okay, this article is worth more than this article. This gets more points than that. And so we know this kind of from talking to faculty, but again, a lot of this was anecdotal. We talk to faculty, they say that impact factor is really a driving force. It's something that comes up again and again in their evaluations, but we didn't have numbers. We didn't know the answers to these questions, right? How often is the journal impact factor actually mentioned in review, promotion, and tenure documents at universities in the US and Canada? What is the nature of these mentions? So it might be that the journal impact factor is mentioned in these documents, but mentioned in such a way that's cautionary or neutral or supportive. We didn't know what the nature of those mentions were. And also, what do these documents say they're measuring with impact factor? So they're using it as a metric, but what do they think it actually indicates? What does it indicate to the promotion and tenure committee? So these were the questions that we wanted to answer. This was part of a larger study. So what we did was collect, review, promotion, and tenure documents from institutions in the US and Canada. We started with those countries because it's easier to obtain the documents. And I say easier, not easy. This was actually the hardest part of the project, was just obtaining the sample of documents, because a lot of them are not public. They're not always in the same place on websites, even when they are public. So there was no way to kind of automate this. And even when we contacted people, faculty, even department chairs at the university, a lot of the time we got a response, something like, we don't actually know if those documents exist, right? So it was difficult to obtain these, but in the end, we did get a sample of over 860 review, promotion, and tenure guidelines. So these could be anything from a presentation that was given to faculty, telling them how to kind of prepare their dossier, or something more formal, like an institutional level guideline. We got documents from 129 universities, and this, I should mention, is a stratified random sample, so it's a representative sample there from the US and Canada, and then 381 academic units from within those 129 universities. We divided these up because not all universities are the same. So we divided these up into R types, which are the research intensive and doctoral focused institutions, M types, which are primarily master's institutions, and then B types, which are primarily undergraduate institutions. And again, there's a varying level of research going on at those institutions, with R types being the most research intensive. And then within the R types, and we focused just on R types here, we didn't have a large enough sample to really do that for the other institution types. We divided their academic units up into the life sciences, physical science and mathematics, social sciences and humanities, and then multidisciplinary. So we might have College of Arts and Sciences, right? So we would classify that as multidisciplinary. So this is our sample. And I should mention that all the data from this project is openly available, not the documents themselves, because those belong to the institutions, but all the analysis that we did on these documents, all of that is openly available here on Harvard Dataverse. So you can go through, play with those numbers, check our analysis, etc. All right, so with respect to impact factor, we first had to go through the documents and kind of do a general reading, because it wasn't so simple as just saying, okay, impact factor, right? There are actually multiple ways in which the impact factor gets mentioned in these documents. So first we did a screening, read through them briefly, and identified some terms that we really wanted to focus on. So this top ring here are the terms that we consider to be directly referring to the journal impact factor. So impact factor, impact score, impact metric, and impact index. Is anyone taking account of how many times I say the word impact in this? And then the second circle are terms that are some way referring to journal impact. So high impact journal, impact of the journal, journal's impact. Those are the two circles, those are the set of terms that we focused on analyzing. There's a larger set of terms that we found throughout these documents that we think are indirect but probable references to journal impact factor. Things like top tier journal, major journal, high impact journal, right? Or no, high impact journal, sorry, is up there. But highly ranked journal or significant journal, prestigious journal. We think these are probably ways in which people are referring to the journal impact factor, but since they're indirect and we're not necessarily sure, we didn't include those in the analysis. So we're only analyzing the terms from those top two rings, all right? So what did we find? First of all, very basic question. How often is journal impact factor getting mentioned? In what percentage of institutions are we seeing explicit mentions of journal impact factor or those closely related terms? So the overall number is 23% of institutions in our sample mention the impact factor or related terms in at least one of their review, promotion, and tenure documents. We expected that number to be a little bit higher, but I'll talk in a few minutes about why that number maybe wasn't as high as we might have expected. And it has to do with those group 3 terms, right? And when we break this down by institution type, we see a different picture. So that number goes way up for R types. So it's 40% of R types are explicitly mentioning journal impact factor in their documents, but only 18% of the M types and 0% of the B types. So the more research intensive, the more doctoral focused institutions are mentioning the journal impact factor much more often. When we break this down by R types, when we look at discipline, it was pretty similar. So 33% of life sciences, 29% of physics and math, 21% of social sciences, humanities, and 17% of multidisciplinary. We didn't have a large enough sample to kind of do a statistical comparison there, but pretty close across those disciplines. All right, so then we looked at the actual mentions themselves. So instead of just counting, we went through and we read each one of these, and we classified them as either supportive, cautious, or neutral, depending on how they talked about the impact factor. And just as a methodological issue, we had 2 evaluators go through and independently rate these. They agreed on over 80% of the classifications, and then those which were in question, we had a 3rd person evaluate, and we took the agreement there between the 2 reviewers. So when we look at that, overwhelmingly, the mentions of journal impact factor were supportive of its use in evaluations. So 87% of these institutions that had a mention were supportive. Only 13% of those institutions that had a mention expressed any type of caution about using this measure. And that could have been very lukewarm, like, maybe we don't think this is such a good idea. None of them heavily criticized the journal impact factor or prohibited its use in evaluations, not a single one. And then we had the 17% that had at least one neutral mention, something like, you can list journal impact factor. But we didn't consider that to be necessarily supportive or cautious. It was just, you can list it. So overwhelmingly supportive, these mentions. We're here, at least in part because of DORA, so we have to look at that in our sample. Not a single DORA signatory in our sample. No mentions of DORA in any of these RPT documents, and we have documents going up to 2016, so this is not an issue of a time lag there. I think it's important to know, I don't have the exact numbers here, but there are very few universities from the US and Canada who have, at an institutional level, have signed DORA. So I think that's what we're seeing here. We have a relatively small, it's a representative sample, relatively small, and we have a very small number of institutions, so we just didn't capture those. It would be really interesting to study institutions that have signed DORA and then see how that's reflected in future revisions of their RPT docs. Okay, and then, so we looked at how many mentions, we looked at the nature of these mentions, and then we wanted to go one step further and figure out what it is they think they're measuring with the journal impact factor and how they're using it in evaluation. So again, we read over these quotes and we kind of picked out reoccurring themes. First of all, a lot of them are unspecified. So if you read, they mention the journal impact factor, they might be very supportive of its use, but they don't say anything additional about how they're using it or what it's intended to measure. So that was a huge percent. So 77% of these institutions with mentions, they just didn't specify what they're using the metric for. And that breakdown by R type and M type. For the ones that did specify, the most common association we observed was that made between journal impact factor and quality. And this could either be quality of the journal or quality of the research itself. So 63% of the institutions with mentions associated this metric with, as a measure of quality. And then you can see the breakdown by R types and M types. So I'd like to show you just a few examples. And this is a particularly spectacular one. Says we will employ the metric article impact factor, which is the journal impact factor multiplied by the number of citations for that article. Yes, collective groan. Journal level metric multiplied by an article level metric. Sigh. But, and the quite spectacular thing is they think that this metric is not only great, but as it says, employing this metric, faculty have incentive to publish in the highest quality journals, which will increase the JIF, and simultaneously produce the highest quality research manuscripts, potentially increasing the number of citations and increasing the, yes, thank you. All right, so this is the level of, yeah, I don't have kind words for this. This is what we're seeing in these documents, and it's incredibly depressing. Because you'd think that as scientists, we would know better, first of all, and you'd think that with all the initiatives like DORA and other research evaluation reform initiatives, that we had moved beyond this, but unfortunately not the case. So there are a lot more examples, and in fact, as part of our open data, we have a supplemental data set online. You can read all the quotes, and they're color-coded like this, so you can see how many times they mention quality and impact and importance, et cetera. So have fun with that. The second most common association was between the journal impact factor and impact, importance, or significance of the research itself. So 40% of institutions with mentions made this type of association. As an example, candidates will be encouraged to submit a statement that explains the importance of the publications, which may include factors such as journal impact factors, and also note publication in journals with low acceptance rates. Apparently that indicates the significance or the importance of the research. So again, quite common. And then the third most common association that we saw was this between the journal impact factor and prestige, or reputation or status, typically of the journal, of the publication outlet. And so that's 20% of institutions with mentions made this particular association. And so here, and I've highlighted things that are in contrast to DORA's message in particular. Publication in respected, highly cited journals counts for more than publication in unranked journals. We are explicitly saying we will award more points for this type of publication than for that type of publication, independent of any type of valuation of scientific merit, right? And it says, yes, we will consider which are the top journals based on their ranking in the Thomson ISI citation database, which generates the well-known impact factors. In this last one, talk about driving faculty behavior. In general, it behooves faculty to be aware of the prestige rankings of the field's journals and to publish in the highest ranked journals possible. So this language is all over these documents and is particularly depressing. All right, but is there any good news? So there were some mentions that didn't support journal impact factor use. So this is one example. It says impact factors of journals should not be used as the sole or deciding criteria in assessing quality. On the downside, again, there's that association between journal impact factor and quality, and they're not saying they won't use it. They're just saying it won't be the sole criteria. So this is a very lukewarm kind of, we don't really like this. The other cautious messages we saw related to discipline. They said, well, we don't think journal impact factor really is relevant for our discipline, might be relevant for other ones, but not so much for us. But it wasn't about the metric itself. It was about disciplinary differences. So very lukewarm, and again, no language that looks anything like DORA language, and no kind of strong statements against use of the journal impact factor. So some conclusions from this. We now have the numbers to support that anecdotal evidence coming from faculty that journal impact factor is featuring in evaluations, perhaps less prominently. Yeah, we didn't see it explicitly mentioned in as high a percentage of institutions as we might have imagined. Why might that be? I suspect we have a situation like this. So we were probably underestimating the use of this metric. We're looking at this tip of the iceberg, which is explicit mentions or very closely related terms, and we're leaving out all these terms, which is a much larger set, that are probably indicating to faculty members who are sitting on these committees, oh yes, you should pay attention to journal impact factor, without explicitly saying it. So I suspect that it's a much larger percent of institutions, and like you said in the survey data, well, do they require it? Maybe not, but they're using it, right? So we don't actually know what's happening inside those committee meetings. I suspect there's a lot more use than we're estimating just from that raw percentage. There's another limitation, and that is precisely that we're not talking to faculty. We're looking at a text analysis of what's in the formal RPT guidelines, right? So how is it the faculty are actually thinking about the journal impact factor, and do faculty think it's important, independent of what's written in those documents? Do they think it's an important metric, and do they think it's one that's being used, whether or not it's required? So we have a little bit of survey data. We've surveyed faculty at those same institutions for which we have RPT guidelines. And we're just in the process of getting some of these results out. But basically, there's a couple interesting findings. First, we asked faculty, what are the most important factors for you when deciding where to publish? And then we asked them, what are the most important factors for your peers when they decide where to publish? And so we saw this interesting effect that they see in social psychology, which is people think they're better than their peers. And so they said, for me, readership. I care about who's reading that journal, right? What scientific audience am I reaching? And that was the factor that ranked the highest for them. So has a readership I want to reach, and then also here, journal publisher venue that I regularly read. So they were focused on readership, and impact factor came in here fifth, right? But when we asked them, what are your peers concerned about? They think their peers are primarily concerned with prestige and impact factor. So they said here, top factor, overall prestige, impact factor moved up to fourth, citations here is in third. So all of this relates to prestige, journal venue, and impact factor. So it's interesting, because the results suggest this disconnect between what academics are valuing or saying they value and what they think their peers value. And in particular, also, we saw an age effect. So those who are actually more likely to sit on faculty committees, evaluation committees, by age and by academic level, whether they were tenured, the older and tenured faculty were actually less concerned with impact factor and prestige. But the younger faculty and pre-tenured were more concerned with it and thought that everybody else was more concerned with it too, right? So one important thing here, and I saw somebody write it on the list outside, if you could change one thing about academic evaluation, it would be talk to your peers. Are we communicating enough with each other about actually what we value, right? Because we're thinking everybody else values impact factor and prestige, but actually we're all saying we don't, okay? So there is this disconnect here, and maybe just a little bit more communication. I'm not saying it's the solution, but it might actually help. Another conclusion, our results raise concerns that this journal impact factor, this metric, is being used to evaluate quality and significance of research, despite the numerous warnings and numerous studies we have showing that there is no relationship between this metric and quality, right? And in fact, there might sometimes be a negative correlation between this metric and quality. And in the paper, we have a whole discussion about those various studies. Again, we don't seem to be relying on the scientific evidence here. So, in that spirit, I want to close with this quote, which is, "It is curious that we would choose to rely upon such a non-scientific method as the impact factor to evaluate the quality of our work. More curious is that we would do so as unquestioningly as we have. Why we have done so is not entirely clear, but that we need to stop is." So with that, I will close. I just want to thank a few people. Juan Pablo Alperin, who's the PI on this project. Meredith Niles is a co-PI together with me. Leslie Szymanski, Carol Munoz-Nieves, Lisa Mathias, who all worked on this part of the impact factor part of this project. And then our funding from Open Society Foundations. And with that, I'm 3 minutes over. I will take questions. Thank you. And I'm going to go back to this quote because I think it's fantastic. Yeah. Are we going to, we're going to do questions at the end. See, sorry, I don't even know what's going on. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Erin. So we will have, there is time in the timetable for questions at the very end. So great to see some data kicking us off. So next up, we are delighted to welcome Professor Paula Stephan. And Paula is Professor of Economics at Georgia State University, and her research focuses on the economics of science and the careers of scientists and engineers, and she is the author of a book called How Economics Shape Science, which I have read, and which I would recommend heartily to this entire audience. I think it really explores many of the issues that we are going to be discussing this evening and through the rest of the meeting. So she's also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a member of the board of reviewing editors at a journal called Science. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. And Paula is going to talk to us this evening about how the journal impact factor is used. Oh, sorry, no, she's not. That was just a joke to put you on your toes. How can we change the research assessment culture? So this is going to be a really exciting 20 minutes. Or have you changed your title? Please, Paula.
This title was on the program, and I decided that it was very close to what I wanted to talk about, so I left the title. So thanks, Stephen, and it's great to be here and to spend time talking about these issues. And it's also lots of fun to reconnect with alums from the next generation, the National Academy Committee. We had a committee report on the next generation of biomedical researchers, and some of the people who were very active in that are participating here. So let me begin. I think it's very helpful to lay out some facts about the biomedical workforce. And the facts I'm going to lay out relate to the United States. I don't have good data for Europe or other countries, but I assure you that if I did, they'd look we have very, very similar trends here. So first of all, the first fact is there's a large and growing number of PhDs are produced in the biomedical sciences in the US annually. It was 8,500 in 2017, the last year NSF has data for, and that was up from 7,200 10 years earlier. And then a large percent do not have definite commitments at the time they graduate. So this is excellent data that the National Science Foundation collects through a survey called the Survey of Earned Doctorates. So the SED has a response rate of over 96%. And the reason why is on most campuses, people think you have to fill it out if you're going to graduate, okay? And that's not true, but the data's there. And what you can see from this is that this is the percent of people that have definite commitments for employment at at doctorate award among U.S. doctoral recipients. And you see that NSF presents it for different disciplines, and you see that the discipline that ties here with engineering is the life sciences, in which it's been going down. It's just ticked up just a wee bit, it's under 60%. And then the next is the largest percent with definite commitments are definite commitments for postdoctoral positions. Okay, and you can see that in this data. This is the postdoc rate for US doctorate recipients. And of course, this is for people who have definite commitments. And if you look at, it's the highest here in the life sciences. It peaked at about 70% of all the people with definite commitments were going into a postdoc position in the early 2000s, and came back up with the crisis. And now it's down to about 62%, but pretty high. And the next fact is that a large percent of postdocs aspire to tenure-track jobs. I don't think that's a surprise to us at all. Here's some data that Henry Sauerman and Mike Roach put together that some of you may have seen an article about this. There was both an article in PLOS and an article in Science analyzing some of this data. It's a survey of people at 39 institutions, and they ask across fields, if you planned on taking a postdoc, that's what PD refers to here, or if you didn't plan on taking a postdoc. And in the biomedical life sciences, you'll see that this dark red is faculty research positions, and 61%, you can have multiple responses here, so these things don't add up to 100. But 61% of the sample listed that they had an aspiration, or at least one of their aspirations, was to be a faculty in a research position. And then a very small percent will actually obtain tenure-track positions. I think most of us in here know that. If you look at some recent NSF data, fairly recent, NSF says that for people who've been out 3 to 5 years, 10.6% of the biological, agricultural, and environmental scientists will have a tenured or tenure-track position, and that was down from 17.3% in 1993, 20 years earlier. So it's about a 40% decline from that time. And you can see that it's the lowest across disciplines, although there's some pretty low rates there from other disciplines. And then I referred to the Next Generation National Academy Committee, and one of the graphs that we have in the report, and I would urge everyone in here to look at some of the things that are in that report, is that we looked at, over time, what types of positions did people getting PhDs get based on their cohort. So there are lots of things going on in this diagram, so let me just explain. This is people who've been out 1 to 5 years. So we can go back to data, and in 1993, we can say, if you've been out 1 to 5 years, what sector are you in? And we divided that into these sectors. So red is tenure or tenure-track position, okay? And the ones I particularly want to focus on here are tenure or tenure-track position, and purple is non-academic, non-research. So this is people who've been out 1 to 5 years, and you see the percent in tenure-track positions for people who've been out 1 to 5 years declines with each cohort. The last one we had the data for that report was 2013. And then look at, this is people who've been out 6 to 10 years. And we see that it was about 30% in 1997 for people who'd been out 6 to 10 years, had a tenure-track position. And this is the percent who are in non-academic, non-research jobs. And then this is people who've been out 11 to 20 years. And we see that people who'd been out 11 to 20 years in 1993, about 37% had tenure-track jobs, and a much lower percent had non-academic, non-research jobs. And then look at these halcyon days for people who've been out more than 20 years. In 1993, almost 40% were in tenure-track positions. And look at, even for that group, it's declined remarkably over time. And the purple line is non-academic, non-research. Now, this graph was first produced for the NIH Workforce Committee in 2012, and it's done again at the University of Kansas, who put a lot of work into doing this. And Shirley Tillman was one of the co-chairs of that NIH committee. And I mean, we really thought, I was a member of that committee also, we thought this graph was just very telling. In particularly the red line really going down for every cohort, and that purple line really going up for many cohorts, which is non-research, non-academic jobs. And so the final one, which is absolutely no surprise to anyone here, is that bibliometrics play a really large role along the way. And one of the things I always like to say, some of you in here have heard me say this many times before, that publication in a top-tier journal, which generally, for many people, if you ask them, means Science, Nature, or Cell, is the get-out-of-jail card of postdoc, of being a postdoc. And I was also on the National Academy's postdoc committee, and one of the things we heard again and again were people saying they were staying in their postdoc position until they hit one of the big three as a first author, and that would be their exit or their get-out-of-jail card. So more generally, and as everybody here knows, bibliometrics, especially short-term bibliometrics, play a large role in hiring, in third-year review, in evaluation for grants, and as we just heard, in promotion. And I've been particularly interested recently, and Anna asked me just to mention this, in how the heavy reliance on short-term bibliometric measures arguably encourages risk aversion when it comes to funding individuals as well as hiring and promoting people who take risk. And so you can see this with some work I've done with two colleagues. One of the colleagues is Jean Wang, who's at the University of Leiden, and the other colleague is Reinhilde Vulger, who's at KU Leuven. And we had an article in Research Policy, and then there was a comment that summarized this research in Nature with this graphic that Nature designed, not us, I have to say. Okay? So the premise of this work is that novel research that combines streams of knowledge that have never been combined before is riskier than research that doesn't do that. And it's more likely to be frontier shifting and also more likely to fail. And we have operationalized this by looking at the number of first ever journal pairs in references of papers published in 2001. And we find that novel research, papers that combine streams of research that have never been combined before, are very rare. 89% of all publications in 2001 don't do that. 11% do, but generally they only make one or two combinations. But there's a tail of this, which is not surprising, in which we see a large number of novel combinations, and we call those highly novel. And novel research, we find, has higher citations, but it also has much more variance, which we see this as a measure of, as being correlated with risk. And it's more likely to be top-cited, but it's also more likely to, quote, fail and get virtually no citations at all. And I think what really struck us, particularly when you think about promotion and when you think about hiring to begin with, is that novelty takes time to show up at all. And so the aqua line here is highly novel papers. This is the probability that it'll be a top-cited paper. And the flat line here is non-novel papers. And what we see is that in these first couple of years, the highly novel papers, which end up being much more likely to be highly cited, are just not showing up at all. And that's so important, I think, because, you know, we're putting so much emphasis for early career people on things that happen right at the beginning of their career. And this type of measure suggests that we're not even going to see what they may be up to. And then, not a surprise to anyone here, I think there's a negative correlation with journal impact factor. Now, why? We don't know whether it's selection, self-selection, where you submit the paper, or whether it is an editor's decision, but there's a very, very strong negative relationship. So, I mean, I think the implications are fairly straightforward. It suggests that heavy reliance on short-term bibliometrics, such as impact factor, and recent citations biases decisions against investigators who are doing novel research, and we think some of this is highly or more likely to be risky. And yet, we know that funding agencies, there are certain funding agencies that absolutely require that you report your citations and the journal impact factor in your application. And then there are funding agencies that don't say you have to do it, but when you submit your grant through the university, they have you add it. The European Research Council, I've served on panels there, everybody's vita has impact factors associated with their CV. And it's not that they require it, it's just your university says, oh, you better put it on if you want to be competitive at the ERC. And you see similar things in many other places. And then hiring committees look at such metrics. And I don't know, one of the things I'm interested in your research, Erin, is that at least in my university, in many ways, not talking about hiring so much, but talking about third-year review and promotion, the person who really pushes here is the provost. The provost says, I gotta see those high impact factors or I'm not gonna let this person go through. And that really trickles back down to the department, and the department starts taking what the provost is saying. And so it really seems to be, at least in some universities, I think, fed somewhat from the top. And I think artificial intelligence really encourages a lot of this, particularly in hiring decisions, in going through lots and lots of CVs and being able to sort it out. I should tell you that just very recently, and it's very preliminary, we've extended this research by examining the relationship of novelty to getting funding from the European Research Council. So for those of you who don't know, the European Research Council is the major funder, a bottom-up funder in Europe. It has a very large budget, and it has 27 different panels that it funds people for, and it funds starter grants, those are people just out, advanced grants, and occasionally it has a program called consolidator grants. And anyway, we were able to get all successful grantees, and 67,000 applications have been made to date. So we got all successful funded people, and we got a very large sample that seems to be random of non-funded. And we distinguished between those who had submitted a proposal, who'd done novel research in the past, versus those who had not, to look at what their funding decision looked like. And we found that those with a history of novel research are more likely to be, those without a history of novel research are more likely to be funded than those with a history. But, and I think that really speaks to the fact that review panels act like insurance agents, and all they want to look at is loss. They sit there worrying that if they let this by, they might really have made a mistake, you know, and have squandered resources. And so they look at negative tail, I really think. But interestingly enough, risks seem to be more tolerated for senior investigators. The people who are really getting penalized here are the starter grants. Those are the people. So once again, it's these bibliometrics really having, I think, a very adverse impact on early career people. So what can be done or what should be done? And I have to say, I've been on so many National Academy committees and I've made so many recommendations with a lot of colleagues in this room. So I think what should be done and what can be done. It's a hard road here, but let me say it again, okay? I think most importantly, we've just got to stabilize the biomedical workforce. PhD programs and postdoctoral programs are used as inexpensive ways to get the research done. And I think this creates an unreasonable amount of competition for a limited number of research positions, and that these are being allocated on bibliometric measures. And I just think it's just been killing the system for a long time. But now we've got all these bibliometric measures and AI, et cetera, so it just exacerbates the problem that we've known that it's been there for a long time. And I want to remind all of us that there are other ways to get the research done. I really have strongly felt and continue to feel that it's time to create an increased number of staff scientist positions and to quit growing the supply of PhDs for research positions that are just unlikely to be out there. What can be done at universities? Well, I mean, and I think everybody here really believes this, that we need to dedicate more resources to evaluating by reading and not evaluating by counting. I think, Frank, you've said something very similar to that. And we've just got to educate deans and provosts to the downside of bibliometrics. I really think that these people, at least in some institutions, are under lots of pressure between departments, and they're under pressure, and bibliometrics are an easy fallback for them. So I think in terms of what we can do, we've really got to think about that. I think we've absolutely got to require applicants for positions and promotions to submit packets of their best and not everything, and be selective. And I think we've got to stress the research portfolio as an important criteria. And I believe that for panels also. I mean, one of the things that I think has really gone amok is that review panels review proposals one by one, and they never think about what their portfolio is. They never think, and we as investors, you don't buy a stock one by one. Hopefully you don't. You should buy stocks and think about how it relates to your portfolio, okay? Well, we need to make funding decisions. We need to make promotion, hiring decisions, and thinking about the portfolios we have. And not everybody's going to do exactly the same thing. We need some high-risk people. We need some probably low-risk people. We've got to get this done. But we don't want to have it all be the same. And more generally, I just think we're missing so much by not having a place where failed research gets published. People don't learn from other people's mistakes or things that didn't work out or whatever. And people should also get credit for that. And I'm very, very keen on de-escalating the arms race. I think rankings are absolutely killing the research enterprise. I really do. I think they were already there before the Shanghai rankings, but I think the Shanghai rankings, particularly, you can see the effect in Europe, have been very, very detrimental to building strong programs. And instead, everybody's worried about counting because that's what places like the Shanghai rankings do. They count. They count high impact factors, they count science, they count nature, et cetera. And that's just killing our enterprise. And that's a very hard thing to change, but institutions all across the United States really spend so much of their resources and so much of their efforts thinking about where they stand in the rankings. And then I'm a firm believer that we have over-relied on the university model as the place to get all our research done in the United States. I think we need a little diversity here. I think we need more institutions where people aren't engaged in training. I think training needs research, but research doesn't always have to come with training. And I think it's important to have other models out there and to have a little competition going on, and to also have research going on where we're not producing more PhDs. I once said that birth control is the most effective, that abstinence is the most effective form of birth control. And I really believe that in terms of research institutes that can't give PhDs are not going to be doing their research by hiring cheap PhDs, okay? And then I think we really need to start thinking about different funding models. I'm not at all convinced a lottery is the way to go, but I have to say there's some interesting research out there, and I would really suggest that people go look at Carl Bergstrom. He's at the University of Washington. He's an evolutionary biologist, and he's done just some really interesting work on lotteries. And I would encourage you to look at his website and some of the things he talks about. And for those of you who don't know, the Volkswagen Foundation in Germany is now funding most of their proposals through a lottery, and also the Swiss Foundation is funding a lot of its proposals through a lottery. So it's not something that people are just whistling about. There's a little bit going on here. And then I really think, and I'll close with this, I think we need to generate good, reliable placement data. I think this goes back to my first point that we've got to stabilize the biomedical workforce. I just really think that undergraduates need to know career prospects before they go to graduate school. They don't need to just get their information from one faculty member who hopes to recruit them to work in their lab, okay? And in this respect, I think some progress is being made. And the progress here, I really want a shout out to Ron Daniels. Ron Daniels, many of you may know, is the president of Johns Hopkins, and he chaired the Next Generation National Academy Committee that some of us in here were on. And one of the things that he did while the committee was meeting, not after we wrote our report, but while it was meeting, he formed the Coalition for the Next Generation of Life Scientists. And he got 37 universities by the time the report went public to commit to making career data available in the biomedical sciences. And I would encourage, let's see if the mouse is going to work. Oops. I don't think this mouse works. Maybe somebody, oh, it is working. It just doesn't work on my screen. So this is, this database, and this tells you all the institutions that have agreed to collect data, both on PhDs and on postdocs. And it's growing over time. And let me just give you one example here of UCSF. They have these dashboards, but one of the things that really appeals to me is that we can look at the year of separation, like let's say 2015. This is for postdocs, and we can find out what percent went on that separated in 2015 are in further training, or they're in primary research, primary teaching, et cetera. And then you can see the sector they're in, and then you can see the job function they're in. And one of the things that really I think is striking about this is data we've been trying. Trends in the early careers of life scientists. In 1996, we made this recommendation, but we simply didn't have a good way of getting the data. Now through LinkedIn and lots of things, you can get this data, and I've gone through a lot of these, and for almost every institution, they've been able to find everything but 11 to 12% of the people. So with that, I will call it a day. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paula. I'm very glad to see someone calling for staff positions. I think that's a real key to change here, and also another ally in the fight against the cancer that is university rankings. Oh, I think my microphone is gone. Hopefully it will come back. So we move on now to the third speaker of the evening, and we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Bodo Stern. So Bodo is Chief of Strategic Initiatives, and in that capacity, here at HHMI, and in that capacity he works directly and very closely with HHMI's president, Erin O'Shea, and thanks to that close relationship, he's able to step into the breach to give Erin's talk and to tell us how HHMI is evaluating researchers. So Bodo joined HHMI in 2015. Prior to that, he was at Harvard. And before he joined Harvard, he was a senior scientific editor at a journal called Cell, which, I don't know, I've never heard of it. But anyway, over to Bodo.
Thank you, Steve. Erin sends her regrets and apologies that she cannot be here tonight. She had to take care of an emergency that just came up. I hope she will be able to join us later for the meeting. And I also hope that these slides are self-explanatory and really good so that my commentary is supportive but not essential. Because I don't see the, hang on, where are the, okay, I want to start by thanking Boyana and Erika for your opening remarks. I want to thank Anna, who is really the master organizer of this meeting, with help from Boyana. I want to thank Stephan for from DORA for co-sponsoring this meeting. And I also want to give a shout out to our conference services that will sustain us with excellent food throughout our really energy-consuming discussions here over the next 2 days. And also communications and AV for making sure that we always have slides here and that we can also send out that people from outside can join our discussions. Before I dive in, I just want to give you a few words about HHMI. HHMI has a long history of supporting discovery science, and we are proud of it. But at the same time, we know that we can improve. It's not just enough to do good science. It's not just enough to focus on what science we do. It matters also how we do it. Yeah? And for that reason, we have defined some strategic priorities that are supporting our efforts in discovery science. And I've listed them here. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, a healthy academic ecosystem, and under that umbrella, we cover scientific publishing and academic incentives, and public engagement. And with this new framework, we're also looking at how do we select our scientists, how do we assess our scientists, and I will give you some more information on how we are assessing our scientists when they come up for renewal. Now, we know there is improvement possible and necessary also in our processes, and we all hope that we will learn from these discussions. That's why we are here, yeah? That we can learn from each other how to improve assessment. But especially the review of our HHMI investigators for renewal. These processes have been honed and improved for like decades. And we think there is something that we have learned from these decades of experiments that we would like to share. Now, this meeting is about how we can improve how scientists and scientific work are evaluated, recognized, and rewarded. Last year, we hosted a meeting here, it's about a year and a half ago, a meeting co-organized with ASAP Bio and Wellcome on how we can improve peer review. And that meeting and this meeting, we actually see as closely linked because both meetings had really one central element, and that is this question here. How can we diminish the corrosive influence of journal names and metrics in research assessment? At this peer review meeting in 2018, we had scientific editors, scientists, early career senior scientists, funders, discuss how peer review can be improved. And one of the very early outcomes of that meeting was that there was an agreement among the participants that what we really need is that the content of the peer reviews needs to be published. We need to have more transparency of the evaluation process. And since then, more than 100 journals have signed a letter committing to making peer review reports available. We've also seen many interesting experiments in peer review come on board. So there is some progress that has happened since that meeting, but there's a lot more progress that we need to make in order to really allow the kind of research assessment that we need in the future. Progress on the side of scientific publishing. These are what we consider the three major challenges. We already mentioned in all the keynotes, scientists are evaluated based on where they're published, not what they publish. And one major reason why this is such a pervasive, the journal impact factor is such a pervasive metric that just doesn't go away, is because the journals just don't give us anything else. They just tell us this was published in this journal, and because we don't have access to the evaluations, the journal impact factor pops up as a proxy for impact. And so what we really need as a second point, therefore, is we need to have more transparency and accountability. We need to have the results of the peer reviews available, because then they can help and inform the assessment of scientists at institutions or funders. And finally, there is a lack of credit at the moment. Scientists do not receive discoverable credit for all their contributions. For example, how do you figure out who did what on a collaborative paper? When you have 30 authors, there's no way of knowing who did the experiments of a particular figure. Who did collect the data sets? Who wrote the software? All of this, it's important. If we are talking about interdisciplinary collaborative science, we need to make sure that people get actual credit for the work they have done. And that applies also to the peer reviewers. If they have done a great peer review, and we want to make sure that they can be credited for that. Yeah? So these are the three challenges. And here is how, very briefly, how we think scientific publishing needs to change in order to support healthy research assessment practices. Autonomy and recognition for researchers. It should be the authors, not editors, that share their work. This already happens in the form of preprints. Authors put preprints up on preprint servers. We think it should happen for all versions of a paper. And then credit should be assigned based on individual contributions. Articles should be published open access, freely available to anybody who wants to read them on the day of publication. And all works should have unique identifiers so that we can track who has used them and how often they have been used. And finally, as I mentioned already, transparent evaluation of scientific work. That it means the peer review reports should be available. We also think it's important that the peer review reports are somewhat distilled so that it's easier for readers and for academic institutions to use these distillations and the peer reviews for their assessments and for decisions what to read in the first place, so that we can replace the journal name with these new kinds of transparent evaluation forms. Now, all of this will not happen overnight. It will take years to experiment and figure out how we can move publishing into an area, into a process where authors share, everything is open access, peer reviews are available and distilled. It will take years. So the question is, what can we do in the meantime? Yeah? And that's where I want to shift gears and now tell you about how we evaluate our investigators when they come up for renewal. One of our guiding principles is people, not projects. We place big bets on creative individuals that have been successful in the past, but we provide them with the level of funding and the length of funding so that they really can follow their scientific nose and do the research that they think they should do. Now, if our focus is on people, not projects, we need to have a robust way of assessing that the people we have are really should be renewed, and we should fund them in the future. And so these are the criteria that all of our investigators know very well, and the advisors that I'm talking about in a second know as well. Now, we want our scientists to focus on basic science, discovery science, and this because we believe that this is the foundation for all benefits that stem from science, whether it's translation, applications. Basic discovery science is really the foundation for anything afterwards. And that is reflected in our guidelines for our scientists, the criteria that we use to evaluate them. Pursue rigorous and deep biological studies. Lead research fields into new areas of inquiry. That's sort of along the lines of what Paula talked about, novelty. That is something that we really cherish in our scientists. Develop innovative tools and methods. Forge links between basic biology and human health. That's not essential. Not all our scientists, many of our scientists are basic scientists. They don't work on something that is related to human health, but some people do, and that is not held against them. That's a good thing. And demonstrate promise of future contributions. And finally, a criterion that we added a few years ago: actively serve and train at host institutions and in the community. Now, we do not expect that all these criteria are satisfied by our scientists, but we want a successful combination of these criteria for scientists that are going to be renewed. This is the process that we use. We reviewers. I'm talking about the reviewers, materials, and in-person meeting. So we're choosing respected leaders and advisors. We assemble a group of 20, 25 every time we review 15, 20 investigators. And these are respected leaders in their field. At least 30% are women. Some of them are long-serving members of our advisory boards so that we get consistency throughout the years of reviewing our investigators. But we add ad hoc experts on each review. These advisors, these reviewers, they serve as advisors. We trust their advice, but the decision is made by HHMI leadership. I think that's an important distinction, that these people write critiques, but they don't make the decision. The decision is made based on the advice, but by HHMI leadership. And we spent a great deal of effort of reviewing our reviewers to make sure that we continue to have really the best people in the room. That can be a laborious process. The materials that we ask from our scientists are a research report that describes what accomplishments the scientist has achieved in the past appointment period and what the future plans are. They will select 5 of the most important papers. They can be preprints. I'll talk a little bit more about these 5 papers, and then they write a statement about mentorship and community activity. And at an in-person meeting, they give a presentation on their past accomplishments and their future plans, which is followed then by a question and answer session where the advisors ask questions. After this question and answer session, the advisors deliberate. And using these deliberations as a basis, and the talk and the questions, HHMI leadership makes a decision whether this scientist should be renewed or not. Now, I do want to highlight the emphasis on the 5 most significant papers, because that does 2 things. It tells our scientists that we care about impact. But because we are asking our advisors to only look at 5 papers, it frees them up from looking at where that paper is published, because they can read the paper in detail and can make up their own mind whether that paper is actually really a high-impact paper. And the scientist will provide a short statement that describes what they think the major impact of this paper is. So you see, by just pointing the advisors to just 5 papers of the scientist under review, you manage to take out the journal impact factor and the quantity of output, because they can focus their analysis on a few key papers of the scientist. Now, all of these papers must be publicly available. They are either published in a journal. If they are not published in a journal yet, they must be on a preprint server. And that can be, for example, important when an advisor wants to seek some advice from some colleague. They wouldn't be able to share privileged information, but if it's on a preprint server, it's of course public, and you can get advice on that preprint. So just in summary, what counts in this assessment of HHMI investigators? We use expert advisors. We focus on the 5 critical articles. And that means we focus on past accomplishments. It's really, we follow the guideline. Past accomplishments, signal future success. It really boils down to the question, has this investigator made a contribution that is significant enough that if you took those contributions out, the field would be different. If the field would not be different because other people have made similar advances, that could be an issue for the renewal. So that is what we refer to as the deletion tests. It doesn't count how many papers a person has published, where the paper is published, and how much research funding the person has received. So just to wrap up, we think from this HMI process, we can consider certain elements for the evaluation of tenure and promotion committees, including the focus on a few research articles rather than on the whole work. And in fact, I think that was also on your, that is sort of also on your slide, Paula. So something that we've heard now several times. We've been fairly secretive about our process in the past, but it's now available for everybody to see, because we realize that this is something that other places that are also thinking about research assessment could benefit from. So there's a much more detailed description here. And I just want to finish by coming back to what I said at the beginning. There's a lot of expertise in the room. We can really learn from each other. Let's make the most of this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bodo. That was a superb job, particularly given the very late notice that you had of your position on the program. So we do now have about 20 minutes or so for questions and answers and discussion. I think I might like to invite the 3 keynote speakers up onto the stage then, who are the focus of attention, and invite you, the audience, then to give us your questions. And, well, comments are also welcome, but they would be particularly welcome if they are very pithy. If I detect a certain grandiloquence, I will maybe ask you to quickly get to the point. And as you've seen, HHMI have these wonderful cubic microphones, of which there are a number around. So Gary, I see, is the first to grab the grab the cube. So please, Gary. Why don't you come to the middle, and if you don't mind being a little bit more exposed. Oh, you're mic'd up, I think. Are you? Oh, you're.
Okay.
Oh, okay. You stay here.
That's funny that I had one.
Sorry.
Oh, you have one too. Yes. Okay.
A question is for Bodo. So let's say that I apply for a grant in the same cycle as Dr. Yamamoto applies for a grant. How do you differentiate between my 5 publications and Dr. Yamamoto's 5 publications?
So, you wouldn't get a grant. You would be employed by HHMI. But we have an eligibility window where people are considered for an HHMI investigatorship, and so that is from 5 to 15 years. Yeah. So 5 years is long enough that somebody can have, and somebody who will be successful should have evidence of independent contributions from their lab, and 15 years, of course, it was 10 years more opportunities. But you would both would only be evaluated for, you would focus on the 5 papers. So I think it balances out a little bit the difference between 5 and 15 years. But you wouldn't compete with Keith.
We have a question at the back, and then one here.
Hi, thank you very much for the very enlightening talks. Leslie Henderson, I'm at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth, and I want to thank both Stephen and Paula for the emphasis on increasing the ranks of research scientists. We have recently begun to do that, and I had a question for you as well as some of the funders in the room. I know NCI has a mechanism by which you can get institutional funding for research scientists that aren't, staff scientists that aren't tied to a given individual investigator in a lab. That seems essential, really, for this sort of cadre of people to have gainful employment with any sort of security. Do you know of other institutes or other funding mechanisms that support research scientists in this institutional sort of way?
Our scientists have very generous research budgets that actually allow them to have research scientists in our. I mean, HHMI labs have actually quite a number of research scientists employed, and that is, of course, thanks to fairly generous budgets. Yeah.
I was more hopeful of more generic funding mechanisms outside of the HHMI cohort.
That would be for a granting organization.
Right.
I mean, we employ our investigators and many of the scientists in their labs, and that includes a lot of staff scientists. So, yeah.
Well, I have to say that I think both for the Next Gen committee and for other groups I've been on, we've looked for examples of how to get of funding for staff scientists, and it's hard to find many places. And I think NCI is great what they're doing, but I also think if we check, there are not many of those positions yet.
Yep.
So I really think this is, I mean, for a long time, I've advocated increasing postdoc salaries, and I've advocated it for 2 reasons. For one is equity, and 2 is for helping universities to understand that postdocs are more expensive and to begin to substitute staff scientist positions for postdoc positions. And so I think there also has to be economic pressure that the way we've been staffing our labs aren't the cheapest, that cheap is creating bad incentives here.
Thank you.
We have one here, and then Jessica.
A couple of questions related to suggestions raised. So And I'll just ask my questions and then you can talk. So one is related to the peer review and transparent peer review. And we have a problem now that people don't have time to read the papers. And to think that they have time to read the peer reviews and the papers, I think is not realistic. The second issue that was raised is about staff scientists, but the modular budget of $250,000 per grant has not changed for 25 years. Postdoc salaries, rightfully so, have increased, but with that modular budget, and NIGMS is absolutely a disaster in this way. It's forcing young investigators to staff their labs with cheaper and cheaper graduate students. So it's really working against the system. You talked about citations times journal impact factor. One way to change that is to divide citations by journal impact factor, so which is more realistic. Because the highest the journal impact factor is, if your citations are higher than that, that means it's a good paper. And so putting the journal impact factor in the denominator as opposed to the numerator would make a difference. So I'd like your comments on those.
I can start on the transparency. So I have two comments. I totally agree that, if we already have problems reading all of the paper, then we won't read. But I don't think it's a matter of that we need many people to read them. It's important that the people who do want to read them have them. Yeah. So I think access to the peer review reports is critical, even if only a small fraction actually reads them. And the second point that may have gotten a little bit amiss is we don't think it's sufficient to publish the peer review reports. It's also important that we figure out ways to distill those reports, yeah? So that we attach something to the paper that is a fairly quick note to a potential reader. This is, let's say there's agreement of the peer reviewers that this is a rigorous paper. I mean, the scientific community needs to decide what exactly those distillations look like, but that will help people fairly easily to spot what papers to read and what papers to rely on. Yeah? So it's not just publishing the reports that can be just as long as the paper. It's also distilling the reports in useful ways for the community and for the readers.
So let me just make one kind of comment about the staff scientists. I mean, it is a resource issue, and it's how we've chosen to use our resources. And I also think it goes back to rankings. I mean, university presidents, deans of medical schools in the United States excel at getting money for buildings, right? And for things like that. And I think it's time that we really begin to put pressure on people to understand that it's what's going on in those buildings that's going to build reputation, and not just a new building, which we're this huge overbuilding of biomedical research space in the United States with the doubling, and it's still going on to some effect. And it has a lot of financial consequences on a lot of campuses. So I think there has to be leadership here among some key institutions to begin to devote some of their fundraising for staffing these labs in different ways. Now, maybe I ate something at dinner and I'm just dreaming, but I really think that it's going to take some leadership within universities. It's not going to happen through NIH, I don't think, and although we have examples, but I don't think we're going to see a big change. And I don't think any one faculty member is going to be able to do this. I think it's going to have to take some leadership.
Jessica.
Okay, so I'd like to extend Gary's question. So let's say that Gary publishes one paper every 3 years. It's a really beautiful, complete story, but I prefer to publish papers that are sort of more intermediate and that come out really quickly with the results. Yeah, so how can we reconcile this need to tell a story with
so
the
I think
limitation?
I would say, if we move into an era where people publish their data in smaller units, then we should, maybe that is time then to revisit, the number 5, or that even to have a certain limited number. Then you may have to go to something else that still captures impact rather than the number of papers. Yeah, right now this is something that has worked because people are trying, to publish complete stories. But if that changes, I agree. Then we need to revisit this approach.
Thank you.
But I think the approach of focusing on, impact, rather than on numbers can remain.
Okay.
At the back
so
here.
This is a question for Bodo. So in your talk, you kind of laid out the ideal HHMI review process. But I was disappointed.
That's how it was. No, I'm
yeah, I was disappointed that you didn't have any data to back up the process that you outlined. So for instance, what evidence do you have that publication venue does not matter during HHMI review?
Well, I mean, I can certainly, right now we don't have that data. What I can say is that we have investigators that are being renewed without, publications in prestigious journals. Yeah. Now, but of course, many of our scientists do publish in these journals. This is an effort that will take many years. I mean, you don't want to penalize people if they decide to publish their papers in Cell Science and Nature. So that, I think that would be the wrong approach at this point. But I think it is people who are participating in this process are surprised how little journal names are being mentioned or contribute.
So just one short comment. I would suggest that it is misleading to have a slide that says HHMI does not consider publication venue if you don't have the data to back up that assertion.
Well, okay, can I, yeah, I mean, what I think the problem is that we are trying to do a cultural shift, a cultural change here, yeah? And that will take time. The way our scientists publish may still be affected, by ways of publishing, and maybe it's trainees that would like to publish in those journals. Yes, many of our scientists' publications are in those top journals, but that isn't necessarily the same as saying that it really matters. Yeah. So I think the numbers. I'm pretty sure what the numbers that you are referring to. You're right. I mean, many of the papers will be in Cell Science and Nature, but I would argue that doesn't tell you that really is critical. It may, in the process.
I think it's an advance that you've published your evaluation procedure because people will make assumptions, I think, as you indicate. Question here is next.
Brooks Hansen, American Geophysical Union. First, a very quick question for Erika, which is on your survey data. Was there any generational difference, or Erika and Anna, or whoever's doing it, in the response rate on what the criteria were for assessment? And then secondly, my pithy comment is if open peer review is good, is open research assessment good? Obviously that's pithy because there's legal and other problems that get in the way, but the challenge or the criticism of both opening them up is it kind of inhibits editorial discretion, which is like we're going to take a paper or take a person who's actually got low reviews because we think that's the right thing to do. So does either one of those inhibit that? And then the larger question for all three of the panelists is the whole focus of the discussion really, and I agree with this last comment as to whether it's 5 papers or impact factor, we're dancing on the head of a pin. It's still, I suspect there's a huge correlation between those 5 papers and journal impact factor. I just suspect, and yes, it's a change. But how do we reward things like important things that are increasingly important, community service, communication, engagement, solving community problems, other things that we really want researchers to do that are really good for science, for communicating science, for public engagement of science, for broad support for the scientific enterprise. None of you mentioned that, and I think you did mention it as one little point at the bottom of the HMI slide, but it'd be interesting to see if there's anything in the tenure and promotion guidelines that really are quantifiable there. So I'd be interested in thoughts on how do we elevate that. Sorry, that was a long dialogue.
Yeah, so maybe I'll touch on that last part. So you're kind of, in that last part of the question, referring to kind of the public dimensions of faculty work. And we did do another paper on that, independent of the impact factor analysis, where we were going through the documents and looking at, how often do they mention the public or the community or outreach or things like that. And unfortunately, what we saw was those terms were mentioned a lot. But when they referred to public or community, they were usually referring to the academic community, and they were referring to service activities within the university. And as we saw, those are the least valued. They're all the way down at the bottom of your list, together with open science, which is hugely depressing, and any kind of community outreach. So we saw that in the current promotion and tenure documents, those activities are hugely undervalued. And even when the university is kind of talking about the importance of public and community outreach, they don't provide an infrastructure for quantifying those contributions or evaluating those contributions in any way. So I think that's a huge problem in the RPT documents. How do you kind of assess that? It's hard because there aren't necessarily raw numbers that you can put on that type of engagement. I think one of the simplest things you can do is provide a lot more flexibility in the forms that faculty are using, provide them a space to simply describe those outreach. That it's not going to solve everything, but it is, at least is giving the faculty the opportunity to describe those activities, where in many of these forms you don't even have a space where you can put that in. And I think there's also other ways, these narrative statements, what is the actual impact of this work? And I don't mean journal impact factor or academic impact even necessarily. Give them an opportunity to describe. And it's harder to evaluate because it's not a number, but let's put that in there at least as one aspect that we're considering.
Right, we're down to our last 5 minutes of Q&A. We have one question here.
Diane O'Dowd, Vice Provost Academic Personnel at UC Irvine. So I really agree with the idea that impact factor as a proxy for quality is doesn't work. But I think that we have to think about some broader aspects of this, which is really thinking about the breadth of the audience that you reach with particular journals, and that is both science or nature, that you reach lots of scientists. Then you have your very good society journals where you reach your peer group, and then you might have very small specialty group. And so that actually really is thinking about impact, and at least in our review system, I think that's how we think about impact factor a lot, is sort of the breadth of audience, and also you're way more likely to get a New York Times commentary or a Scientific American commentary or a commentary in Science about a Nature article or vice versa, something that might reach a broader audience if it's in one of these other journals. So I think that that's something that, again, it can't be just a proxy measure, but that I really think we have to think about the impact in that fashion.
So I just want to make one comment related to that. I understand the point, but also taking advantage of the fact that this is International Open Access Week. Those journals that you're putting forward as examples, Cell, Nature, Science, that do tend to reach a large community, that's assuming you have access to those journals. And there is a huge part of the world that does not have access to those journals. So, and then, the theme of this week is equity, right? Open for whom? So who are we reaching when we publish in those journals? We are reaching one part of the world that happens to work in institutions that has enough money to subscribe to those journals. I've worked in journals, in institutions in Mexico that did not have money for those journals. And so you have to ask, who are you reaching? What % of the world's population? What % of the world's scientists? And I would actually argue that some of those smaller community journals, but that are fully open access, are spreading that knowledge in a much more equitable way. So that's what I would.
Yamamoto?
I wanted to comment on Paula's point about, or actually call to separate research, or at least bigger elements of research, from academics. from academia. She probably remembers that we don't actually agree on whether there are too many graduate students. I don't think there are too many graduate students, but I do think there are too many postdocs. And it's very clear that there is a conflict of interest in the faculty in terms of wanting workforce, hands on at the lab bench as opposed to trainees. So that point is all very well taken. I actually think from our own experience in our career exploration courses at UCSF, what we've discovered is that if academia steps up to its responsibility to familiarize students with the range of career options that are out there, that we're finding that they're leaving happier, going off to other non-academic positions where they can use their training to contribute in many ways across a great diversity of career possibilities that are needed.
And perhaps leaving quicker.
And they are leaving quicker.
I mean, I think that that's a really important thing, and UCSF has been great in doing that, I think.
Moving faster, and they're happier with being able to make these choices. The comment I wanted to make was about the staff scientists. So while I think there are too many postdocs, and that postdocs, the position for postdocs should be really reserved for people who declare that their aspiration really is to go into academic, become an academic PI, then the number of postdocs would drop dramatically. The graduate students would go off to this great diversity of other things. That's what we're seeing, actually. But the number of postdocs would drop dramatically. Lab demographics would change dramatically. And the need for professional staff, what are now called staff scientists, would actually increase, as would the funding available to support them, because there'd be dramatically fewer postdocs. So I think that what we should aspire to in academia is defining a new career track that has high esteem value associated with it, stability associated with it. You pointed out that academia should take responsibility for paying these people. And I think funding agencies should do it in a shared way as they do with faculty, with regular faculty. But I think the funds would be there. The demographics of labs would change. There would be stable people, researchers, PhD trained, who, we all know of PhDs who are spectacular scientists, but end up failing in academia because they don't do the other stuff, either because they don't want to or they don't do it well. And so we lose them from their contribution from the research community. Being able to define a career track that's respected, probably including changing the name of staff scientist, which has a certain pejorative ring to it, would allow that group now to prosper. They would have stable positions. Their partners and spouses wouldn't be asking them when they're finally going to get a job, because they would have them. And I think that if we can move in that way, so it would be a dramatic change in the response to a needed change in the demographics of laboratories. And I think it would really just take one or a small number of institutions to step up and say, we recognize this as a real need, and we're going to define a new stable career track. We're going to pay these people, right, give them benefits and so forth, and because we really need them in our research environment. And I think we can begin that by, a small number, the coalition of the willing that Ron defined, to move in that direction.
Thank you very much. I'm determined to wrap up by 9. We have time for one quick question. I'm sorry, this lady has been waiting very patiently. Just here,
Should I go
please.
ahead?
Yeah, very pithy,
My
if
name
you
is
don't mind.
Maria Elena Bottazzi. I'm from Baylor College of Medicine, and I am just in awe of all these discussions. But I just want to make one comment that maybe is just to remind everyone that research is also morphing, right? And academia now has even different roles in the area of moving what we call discoveries all the way to hopefully eventually develop new technologies, interventions, all the way to the public good and the public use. So I just want to make sure maybe we open up our minds a little bit, for example, in defining when we do research assessment, that Some people do very good in basic science. Some people do very good or are more interested in the translational process of translating science. And now researchers do more and more collaborations with clinicians and hopefully even beyond the health and medicine, engineers, economists, social scientists, right? So I think that academia now is becoming a little bit a hybrid of traditional training of PhD students, postdocs, and morphing into biotechnology type of engines that really can maybe support some of these discussions about staff scientists. So for example, just briefly, in my case, we run a center for vaccine development where even though you may have an academic title, then we also give them the alternative of using a appropriate career professional title as a director of quality assurance or director of quality control. And I think that also adds value to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question from outside the room. Is that correct?
Yes, we do. So, if, for the sake of time, I think I might pose it just as a quick comment to share what our online audience is thinking while our AV team sets up your slide presentation,
yes.
Stephen.
Okay.
But I did want to share that someone online was wondering for Bodo, if you think that the subject matter, the experts that you choose, that HHMI chooses as reviewers, if they are used to publishing in Cell, Nature, and Science, if they might see publications in Cell, Nature, and Science by applicants as more impactful than publications in other journals. And then another submission from our online audience was whether or not HHMI is considered that if HHMI investigators or HHMI professors are acting as reviewers, if there are any data on whether they review applications differently than non-HHMI reviewers. So I'm just going to put that out there as food for thought so that we can move to the wrap-up.
Do you want to very quickly respond to that, or?
I'm pretty sure that we all, our habits, past habits inform how we judge today. And so I think that, even if we say, the journal venue should not matter in the evaluation, but we cannot know whether scientists will still favor those. That is probably, that's a possibility, sure, yeah.
Okay, thank you all for a really fascinating and engaged question and answer. And thanks particularly to Erin, Paula, and Bodo for a really stimulating keynote session. I'm aware my timekeeping is not as good as I promised. It's 5 to 9. I only have half a dozen slides that I will get through rather rapidly, but I just wanted to offer some sort of concluding reflections as chair of DORA about why this meeting is so important to us as an organization, and to sort of give you some sort of personal reflections on my hopes and expectations for the meeting. How do I advance the slides? No. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'll use the mouse. So I hope nobody in this room is unfamiliar with the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment. We are a sort of a growing organization. We have a growing group of supporters. We sort of had a revamp about a couple of years ago, refreshed the steering group, and convened very much a global advisory board, because I think, as all of us must appreciate, it's not enough to change research culture in North America or United States and Canada. It's really got to happen all over the world, because research, academia, scholarship is a quintessentially international action. And although DORA, as Erika mentioned, is probably best known for being somewhat critical of the abuse of the journal impact factor in research assessment, we are very much an organization that recognizes that it's not enough to simply lay down the criticism and then move on. It's really, and one of the focuses that we have for our roadmap for the next couple of years is to be much more proactive about seeking out and finding and promoting good solutions to what is a really difficult problem. And of course, this meeting is very much one part of that activity. But research assessment is something that none of us can avoid. We live in a world of finite resources. There's finite money. There are finite positions in university. And so we are going to have to look at measures of success. And so we are having to grapple with rather deep questions about what it is that we mean by success. And I quite like the operational example of Viktor Frankl, although it does pose some philosophical difficulties. Don't aim at success, he writes, for success, like happiness, cannot be pursued, it must ensue. And it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself. Now, I hope, I think, I believe that that's a statement that probably resonates with everybody in this room. But if you are the president of a prestigious university, you will probably be asking yourself, how the hell do I make that work for my university? How is that going to help me be successful as a university? And so operationally it's difficult, but I think it also taps into the high aspirations that I think bring many people, those signing up for PhDs and postdocs, into a career in research in the first place. They want to make the world a better place. They want to satisfy their curiosity and transform the world with the insights and understanding that they bring. And that brings us then to another problem of, how do we balance the curiosity that people bring to research with the aspirations that they have of changing the world. And there are different philosophies about how best to manage science, and this is a really excellent article, I think somewhat controversial, very deliberately polemic from Dan Sarowitz, who writes very well in this area. It made me rather angry when I first read it, but I was one of the various people that responded to it, and there's a really good discussion that was published in the New Atlantis following the original proposal. But Sarowitz is actually very good at diagnosing the problem, which I think we all know too well. Advancing according to its own logic, much of science has lost sight of the better world that it was supposed to help create. And I think we recognize that our mechanisms of research evaluation grind people into the ground, and we end up chasing citations, impact factors, publications in journals. And the irony here is the stunted imagination of mainstream science is a consequence of the very autonomy that scientists insist is key to their success. Now, I'm not suggesting that we throw out autonomy, although actually Sarowitz takes a rather extreme view, is very much that science has to be managed if it is going to deliver that better world, and that scientists in the free play of intellect have, to some degree, got a little bit lost in the chase for the academic prestige that we know that drives the system. Now, I think he goes too far in that, and I think we have to find a balance between discovery science, as HHMI wants, and the solutions to the problems that, as a world, as a species, we know we face. His vision is quite hopeful in a way, and there's a lot there that I would subscribe to. So the most valuable science will be closely linked to the people and places whose urgent problems need to be solved. They'll cultivate strong lines of accountability to those whose solutions are important. They will, crucially, incentivize scientists to care about the problems more than the production of knowledge. That's a somewhat controversial statement, one that we can perhaps debate a bit more in the coming days, but I think there's a worthwhile point in there. The links agendas to the quest for improved solutions, often technological ones, and so Sarowitz's thesis is that technology keeps science honest, because if your science doesn't produce technology that works, then there's something wrong with it, and that the science they produce will be of higher quality because it will have to be. And I think we have to think through when we are evaluating, and this comes to the point that was made towards the end of the Q&A session about linking, how do we balance the importance of a really new fundamental discovery in cell or molecular biology, for example, and somebody who comes up with a treatment for a disease that is neglected because, to be frank, only poor people suffer from it. And so there are values here that we really need to tap into and think about. So we have to think about our values, and this came up actually in several of the keynotes. And I think as a community, we are very values-driven. Our research in academia is not really a career, it's more of a vocation. And yet, we have this mechanized system of research evaluation that we are going to discuss. I don't pretend for a minute that in the next 2 or 3 days we are going to solve all those issues, but I very much hope that our focus will be on trying to find practical steps forward. I very much believe that those steps are there to be found. Some of them are already being developed among universities and funders, for example, around the world. But I think there are questions that we would want to keep at the forefront of our minds as we go to our deliberations. So how best to work with academics to articulate our shared values and co-create feasible systems. I think that process of co-creation, I think Erin and Paula both talked about the need to talk to the participants, not just researchers, but also provosts and presidents of universities, so that they really know and understand the problem and that we know and understand one another. I think we have to really listen to the concerns of academics. Many of them have high aspirations, but they worry about their career advancement. And they know that there's a misalignment between the values and the aspirations that brought them in and the things that they need to do in order to keep within the academic system. And similarly, I think as Paula mentioned, provosts don't really understand the negative impacts of bibliometrics. And so there are lots of conversations that still need to happen in order to equip and acquaint the academic community with many of the problems that all the people in this room are extremely familiar with. But many of our colleagues back home see it less clearly, I think. And it's too easy for us, perhaps, to be in a bubble sometimes and not recognize the need that we have to, or the issues there that we have to address. And and again, we talk about academic freedom, but I also like to talk about academic responsibility. And I think, academics, not in general, but there is a tendency to focus just on the academic prestige side of things and to forget about, our duties to society. And I think we have to be very cognizant of those duties when many of us are, in fact, publicly funded. And if we are to speak and address the problems of society, as Sarowitz would have us do, then are we, as a community, as an academy, asking the right questions in order to address the problems of the world? And that raises the question then, are we actually representative of the societies who fund us and who we purport to represent? And I think when you look at the representation of women in the academy, or people of color, or other underrepresented groups, then you have to say that actually we do not have yet a healthy ecosystem within academia. And so we have to think much more about who outside the academy needs to get in, and then who else in the various publics do we need to be engaging in order to think through our research agenda. And we have to try and incentivize those things, because ultimately those are the things that we want to do. And then there's a first mover problem, which is, everybody knows the problem, but if even the Harvards of this world or the HHMIs of this world are struggling to do it because they're worried about losing out in some competition, then perhaps there are alliances that we can build. And I would very much like to see some of the those universities that perform well in the awful things that are league tables actually getting together as a group and perhaps deciding to secede from league tables and deciding as a community of institutions that actually they're going to cling to their values and use their values to forge their path to success. So I wish us good cheer, and I wish us great courage for the deliberations the next day. So let me leave you with this quotation. I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life of others expected to me. It's attributed to no one person, but that is the number one regret of people who are on their deathbeds. So let us seize the day. You'll notice it's the top 5 regret of the dying. It's not a regret of the living, okay? And that's because the living forget about their values and the things that they think are ultimately important, because we get distracted by the system. And so let us have the courage, and let us not have this as a regret on our deathbeds. And with that, I would like to close this evening's proceedings and thank all the speakers once again, and thank you for your enthusiastic participation. Thank you.